Thank you for taking the time to sign on tonight. What kind of initially started as bringing together a few universities that I was working with really grew a lot over the last few days as I tried to put this together. So I appreciate you all being on. You're not here to listen to me talk, so I will turn it over to the four. I think Annie is going to go first. Let me just screen share so I can pull up our slide deck. If you're just signing on, if you don't mind putting your university or affiliation in the chat. If you have questions over the course of the presentation, same thing, just drop it in the chat. I'll kind of moderate it so I can so we can get to those after. But assigned these four the unenviable task of trying to consolidate all their work into 10 minutes. So we will do our best to work through these presentations and then answer as many questions as we can at the end. So Annie, I'll turn it over to you. Mute myself here.
Sounds good. Yeah, you can go to the next slide and I will cue you verbally to do that. Or wait, can I don't think I can control it on my end, but anyway, I'll cue you. Thanks, Drennan. I'm really excited to get us started off today. I'm Annie Tulkin. I'm the founder and director of Accessible College. And the mission of Accessible College is to provide students with physical disabilities and health conditions and their families with the supports to ensure a successful transition to college. So I work with students with physical disabilities, so mobility device users, wheelchair users, ambulatory wheelchair users, sometimes mobility device users, and everything in between. I also support students with chronic health conditions, and that ranges everything from Ehlers-Danlos syndrome to POTS to cancer to lupus, and mental health conditions as well. And I bring my background as a former university disability support office associate director to my work. I used to work at Georgetown University in the disability support office there, which is also an academic support office. And that experience really informs my practice in working with students and families now, and I work with students across the country. So my experience at Georgetown really is what brings me to the work that I do now, because we know that colleges provide varying levels of accommodations for students with disabilities, and students with physical disabilities and health conditions in particular have nuanced needs. And because students, there's a big transition from high school to college in terms of the types of accommodations and supports that students might be considering or needing. What I do is coach students and families through that process so that they're asking the right questions and connecting with the disability support offices at the universities ahead of time. I'll have you go to the next slide, Brendan. I wanted to ground us with some information, some data, some facts. So we know that 19%, approximately 19% of undergraduate college students report having a disability, and that includes learning disabilities, ADD, mobility impairments, psychiatric mental health impairments, and health conditions. And these are the students who have gone to the disability support office, self-disclosed, requested, and received accommodations. So you can imagine there's probably a whole nother portion of students who have disabilities that might be able to get accommodations and either have decided not to seek out accommodations or don't know about the process, which is probably a big piece of that kind of unaccounted for population as well. We also know that approximately 7% of the college students who report having physical or having a disability indicate that they have a physical disability or mobility impairment. And those of you who are data folks are probably looking at these numbers and noting that they're coming from two different sets of statistics from government data. But what's really interesting about this too, and that is not accounted for in here, is that disability support offices track students in different ways and categorize them in different ways. So we really don't have a complete data set to know how many students with disabilities are on campuses and what types of disabilities they have. So that's kind of just an interesting caveat. But what we do know is that students with disabilities are on college campuses. And we also know that people with disabilities in general are the largest minority group in the United States. So we can imagine that students with disabilities are likely the largest minority group on any given college campus, which is just an interesting kind of framing for the conversation. So let's go to the next slide. Thanks. I wanted to give you all a brief overview of the laws that kind of impact students as they transition from K through 12 to college. So we have a couple laws that are important and relevant. So IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that's the law that governs special education services for students with disabilities and provides for free and appropriate public education and services in the K through 12 setting. So if your student that you might know, if a student that you're working with or supporting maybe had an IEP, an individualized education program in the K through 12 setting, that's because of this law. If the student had a 504 plan, and this is something that applies to the K through 12 setting, that comes from Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And Section 504, important to note, applies to both public and private schools. It's an anti-discrimination law, so it provides that the student can't be discriminated against because of their disability. So that's important to note. Section 504, interestingly enough, also applies to college, but 504 plans do not directly follow a student to college, which is sometimes a confusion point for students and families. On to the next slide. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, we are coming up to the 31st anniversary of the passage of the ADA in July. The ADA is a really important law. It provides for reasonable accommodations, and I'm doing air quotes, and there are quotes on my slide, in the college and in the employment setting. And the reason I'm doing air quotes is because what is reasonable could be different from place to place and classroom setting to classroom setting, professor to professor. So it leaves a lot of discretion on the part of the people in the Disability Support Office and on the institution and on the professors themselves to determine what is reasonable in that classroom setting. And that's a really big difference from the high school setting. The other really big difference is that students in college have to be the ones to engage in what is known as the interactive process, disclose their disability, and request specific accommodations. So in high school, the parents are usually a big part of that process. And that's where this next law comes into play, which is FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. That's a law that surprises a lot of parents, actually. And once the student matriculates to college, which is a fancy word of saying signs that dotted line and commits to that college or university, FERPA kicks in. So parents at that point no longer have access to the student's grades, to their class schedule, to disciplinary actions. All the communication goes to the student, unless of course the student decides to sign a FERPA waiver with their parent and have their parent give their parents access to that information. But that's a really important kind of difference between the K through 12 setting and the college setting in terms of the student experience and the parent experience, because many parents are used to being advocates for their children. So that's a really important piece for people to know. Moving on. This is kind of the slide with like the tangible things, like how is this different from high school to college? So this is just a brief overview. There's a lot of things that are different between high school and college, but this is the disability specific stuff. So in high school, students with disabilities are usually identified by the school. Teachers and administrators know what the student's condition is, what their accommodations are. It's outlined in a 504 plan or an IEP or an academic plan, which it may be called at some schools. But in college, it's the student's responsibility to self-identify to the Disability Support Office and to provide documentation of their disability to the Disability Support Office. It's important to note that each college has their own set of documentation guidelines. So when a student is applying to a school or looking at a school, they should look at what types of documentation are required to request accommodations, because they vary from school to school. In high school, primary responsibility for arranging accommodations belongs to the school. Typically, the teachers take care of those things. They know that the student needs extra time, or they know that the student needs a note taker. They provide those things for them. But in college, the student has to go through that interactive process with the Disability Support Office. And every college has a Disability Support Office. It might be named something like Accessibility Services, student accessibility services, disability support services. But typically, if you go to the college's website and you put in disability support or disability services, that'll bring up the website. And so the student has to connect with the people in the disability support office, provide documentation, have a conversation with the disability support office, and then be approved for accommodations. And then the student has to bring those accommodation letters to each professor every single semester, and they're supposed to have a conversation with those professors about those accommodations as well. So there's a lot more self-advocacy that is needed on the part of the students. So usually in high school, the teachers are able to identify when the student needs support, and the teachers can contact the parents and can connect with the family to let them know that the student is lagging behind. But another huge shift here in college, the student has to know when something's not working out, and they have to reach out to the disability support office. They have to hire their own tutors. They have to go to office hours and connect with professors that way. And this is a really big shift for a lot of students because they may not have had to have these type of self-advocacy skills in place prior to going to college. They may not have had to talk to their professors in the way that they will need to be able to do in college. So that's really tricky. So it's also important for everybody to understand that if a student has an IEP, typically in high school, transition support services are at least a part of that conversation. But the way that that looks really varies from school to school, from school district to school district. And so for a lot of students with physical disabilities, with chronic health conditions, who also might be interested in sports and clubs and recreational activities, no one's really having conversations with them about what that's going to look like on campus. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so some supports and resources, and just like a little bit more about me as well. So as a side job, I'm also a spin instructor at the YMCA in Silver Spring, Maryland, where I live. And I'm just passionate about sports and recreation in general. And so I work with a lot of students who have physical disabilities and health conditions, and are also looking at schools and trying to investigate how they can engage in sports, either recreationally or NCAA teams at the universities that they're interested in. So for me, this has meant a lot of learning on the NCAA policies, and we can probably people on this call know a little bit about that, which is an interesting piece. And I'm happy to put some information in the chat box if people want to learn more about that. But it is a part of the student's process. And what I guide students through is thinking through the college search and selection process, looking at it holistically. So thinking about the academic needs, thinking about their housing needs, their dining needs, transportation, recreation, the whole shebang, so that they have everything kind of lined up. I also have a Facebook group, and I can put the link in the chat box as well. But it's focused on physical disabilities, chronic health, and mental health, and it's open to students, families, healthcare providers, really anybody who wants to learn more on the topic. And I think I have one more slide, don't I, Brendan? I'm moving at a quick clip. I'm feeling good about this. So I also have a partnership with the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation to work with students with paralysis, and paralysis for the purposes of the Reeve Foundation is defined very broadly. So I have students who have cerebral palsy, students with spina bifida, students who've had spinal cord injuries, strokes, neurological conditions, anything that has some manifestation of paralysis. Students can qualify to work with me through the Reeve Foundation for free for up to 3 hours. And I will hand it off now, but I'll hang on. I'll be here and I'll answer questions at the end if folks have questions, and I'll hand it off to the next presenter. Oh, and there's my contact. There you go. And I'll put it in the chat as well. And Lisa, I think you are next.
There we go. Hi, Brennan. Hi, Brennan. Thanks, Annie, so much. I really appreciate hearing that. And I'm welcoming all my students here today. And so happy, Annie, that you were touching upon IDEA, Section 504, ADA, and hopefully some of that is sounding familiar to students of mine. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Lisa Drennan. I am the founder of Merge Disabilities Inclusion Consulting, and I'm here to share with you some strategies to promote inclusion. So a little tiny bit about my background. I have 30 years experience working in the field of supporting folks with intellectual developmental disabilities to be active and engaged in their community. From there, I had experience working at my local YMCA as the Association Director of Inclusion. So really focused on teaching the rest of the world, right? So YMCA staff how to be more inclusive in their practices, to include in folks with diverse abilities. I'll explain that term in a moment, which led me to Merge. I love that work so much. I wanted to work more with. I primarily work with recreation, sport, and camp organizations, helping them to be more inclusive in their practices. And let's get started. I'm going to share, I know I have a little bit of time, so I'm going to share as much as possible with you. So I've got my timer going here. And yeah, fantastic. So I want to start with sharing what inclusion means to me, because I think this is very important when you're thinking about, in your college settings, or if you're involved in recreation or working in the sport field or any type of working with the community at all. What I want to share is this is my models of participation, and it shows how persons with disabilities or any type of diverse ability or perhaps neurodivergent can participate in activities or sports or recreation opportunities that you may have. Now, if you were to envision that the yellow circle in these 5 different boxes are an activity, and the white dots would represent community members or students, athletes who do not have a disability, and the colored dots represent a person who may have a disability. Okay, so for instance, we start with exclusion, and we're hoping that you're all here now because are not practicing and wouldn't consider exclusion, but we recognize that it does happen. If we moved up to specialized, right, the second one up here, that is when we offer something is for a particular disability. So for example, autism swim or wheelchair basketball. It's structured in the way that a person with a disability is playing amongst their peers that with similar disabilities, the coaches, the support, the equipment used is really specialized to help them in that activity. Integrated is the next step up, and that would be if my best example of this, I'm just going to say, is a camp setting, right? So if you have a traditional camp and you had kiddos that may need assistance or identify as needing inclusion supports, they might have their own staff, right? So they have their own staff here. There's 3 or 4 kids that kind of meet together that have disabilities, and they would work together as a small group. They might go into the larger, we're going to mute that. Okay. They might go into the larger camp or the larger group, but they kind of stay tethered to their staff or support person there. The next one you might be familiar with is Unified Peer Buddy, very popular in high schools and middle schools. And this is usually in a Special Olympics type setting as well. You might be familiar with that, where you have equal number of participants with and without disabilities. Usually the peers are there in a volunteer status, and they work as a team together. And then finally, the space that I'm always trying to help organizations to get toward is full inclusion. So that's when you have an organization, a group, a sport, a team, whatever the entity is that you're working with, and you work to make that inclusive, where you welcome and you engage and you support your community members with diverse abilities or disabilities to be participating side by side meaningfully with their peers. So I just want to clarify, and you might see it looks like a step up program. And what I always say that if you're running a program or you have, specialized or integrated, unified offerings, those are great, but they should always be a gateway towards helping a person by choice to be in a more inclusive setting, right? So be with their peers as much as possible. That's ideally the world that I'd like to see. So Brendan, we can go ahead to the next one. Thanks. So that term Diversabilities, and it is very intentionally part of the name of my company, Diversabilities Inclusion Consulting. And so what I'd like to share here is that if you're working with a group or you're coaching or you're, just you're a camp counselor or you're somehow working with a group of people, there's a very good chance that of the 20 people who are in front of you, that several of them may or may not have a physical or learning disability, a psychiatric, neurological disorder, perhaps autism spectrum disorder, other hidden disabilities, invisible disabilities, right? Intellectual, developmental disabilities, social, emotional, right? If we think of all those different ways that a person can interact, learn, and experience the way around them that can be impacted by one of these, right? That's why I suggest that we look at the whole group and we teach in a way, and it really pulls into universal design or universal design learning, that we teach in a way, we offer something in the way that everybody can be successful. And that, goes hand in hand with inclusion. So I like to clarify that, and that we think of all the different ways that a person may be impacted by a disability or disorder, medical condition. And that's why I use the term Diversabilities. Alrighty, great. Thank you, Brendan. So, wrapping this section up, and then I'll give you a couple quick tips. So inclusion is not an event. It's not a program. It's not a staff member who, oh, well, this person is have a background and they work with people with disabilities. Those might be all parts of how your organization or your school, your campus offers opportunities for people with disabilities, but inclusion is the whole organization, the entire organization being intentional in its work, right? Being very intentional about planning for the success of all. So a little bit of a shift there in the way that you might think. If you are involved in programs that are specific for people with disabilities or helping to give them the resources to be part of the community, that's great. But really, we need a whole organization to think more inclusively on what they can be changing to help everybody to belong in every aspect. Okay, and I'm talking about sports, socially, right? Engaging, of course, in their school settings if we're talking about college. So next slide, Brendan, thank you. I just want to share now, this is very hard, and Brendan, I appreciate you saying at the beginning, like taking everything and wrapping it into 10 minutes, right? So I'm going to give you now in about 4 minutes, probably what would take me an hour to do a full training. So hopefully I'll do them justice, but please reach out if you want to learn more. So these are my inclusion strategies that I set forth, and I tell when I work with an organization, my theory is that inclusion is for all, in all, and by all. So for all mean for everybody, all students, right? Or all athletes or whoever you're working with. For all, in all means in all settings. So in the sports that you offer, in the social opportunities at school, in your hiring practices, right? In every aspect of your university, that inclusion should be considered. So in all, for all, by all. And here's the by all, and this is where I'm speaking to all you. By all means that everybody in your organization, everybody who's a personal trainer or works as a coach, what have you, everybody needs to understand and be familiar with inclusive practices and be on board with being inclusive, to welcome and to engage and to support your community members or your students or your athletes to be part of what you're offering. So just wanted to line that up. We can go to the next step again. Here's just a couple suggestions, right? So these are for my inclusion philosophies that I would share with a group of counselors or coaches or whomever I'm working with. So we want to work to facilitate social connection. And this is really important to think about not just the sport or the activity you're doing, but also look at ways that we can help to socially connect one person with another. Sometimes with folks who do have disabilities, it might be more challenging for them to, reach out and learn about another person to make a friend. So there's different strategies we can use to facilitate that social connection. Flexible thinking absolutely has to be part of how you are, considering using inclusive practices. We have to have flexible thinking. The 8 worst words, I always say this to, that's just against inclusion would be, but this is the way we've always done it, right? So if that makes sense to you, if you've heard somebody say that, we want to really eliminate that type of thinking, like, no, we've always done it this way, because inclusion makes us think differently, makes us be creative in the way that we come up with solutions to help everybody to belong. The third part here is making modifications and being okay with changing the way somebody participates, right? And, whether it's physical or attitudinal, like how can we help this person to participate in what we're doing? What modifications or what accommodations? So working with that person to identify what would help them to meaningfully participate alongside their peers. And then just having great, communication practices, starting with thinking about confidentiality and how we share information, to even how you communicate to your athletes or students, whomever you're working with, using person first language and learning what words, I call it, words to live by, more positive and powerful words versus words to lose. And person first language, just real briefly, is always, and most, I'm assuming most people would know this on the call, but I'll just describe that. It's really identifying the language that we use to identify or speak to a person with a disability, where we put the person first. So we would say, John is a boy with Down syndrome instead of the Down syndrome kid, right? We want to avoid saying things like that, just for example. All right, I know I'm running close on time, so we're going to go to the next one. I always feel that it's a good practice to use in your group classes or recreational activities. Visual tools are always going to be helpful, and they may very well be helpful for kids or teens or adults with visual, emotional, with intellectual, disabilities or hidden disabilities, or the list goes on. But what I say is that these are good for everyone, so you use them for all. Okay, so you could use a visual tools, for instance, to review a schedule, right? Or to show expectations. So the tips on these is that you want to use words and images, right? And then frame expectations in the positive. I'll go over that in a second. I know we're kind of split a slide into 2, but on this visual schedule, for example, you can use the icon images or photos. You want to keep it age appropriate. For younger kiddos, you might put like more cartoony kind of fun things that they could identify, but it gives a listing of the sequence of events that are coming, and it makes it very clear. So that should be available to all to be able to see, so that they know what's coming up next, and it should be reviewed with everybody at the start of any activity. It's a good tip to kind of follow. Our next one here is an expectation list, right? Now, this is obviously something that might be used for a younger group or someone that needs these kind of visual cues, these icons here. But if you wanted to keep it, maybe a little bit more age appropriate, you could use photos, right? Or have them help to find the drawings, however you want to have it. But you want to use the image, and you want to use the written word, and you would go over these expectations with the group. What this really helps is that for everybody to be on the same page. It sounds like a, just a, kind of a silly task. Why would we do this? But we want to be very clear what the expectations are, so that everybody's starting on the right foot, and that those who may not know, how to participate in a new group or a class or whatnot, they may have never been part of something like this, that this will spell it out for them, that we listen to our instructor. Everybody, we want to really be careful to be on time. We're going to follow the routine, and you would review it with them. So the key to these visual tools are to review them with the group, the whole group, not, just taking some people aside, although somebody may get a value out of a one-to-one instruction of it, but we review it with the whole group, and it's available and able to be seen by the whole group. Okay, you may take a copy of one and make it available for a particular individual who could use a little extra help on the expectations, so that you're getting good participation. And I think that might be it, right? Okay, yeah, so just to share, I didn't, Brendan, I'm sorry I didn't have my contact information on there, but I'll throw that into into the chat box, and I'm also going to throw a link to a toolbox that I wrote, a toolkit on friendships between people with and without disabilities. So I'm going to throw that into the chat box, and if you want to download a copy, you'd be welcome to. Thanks, Brendan, for organizing this.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Annie, for sharing your expertise. I've learned a lot today already, and I'm looking forward to learning from Erik when he rounds things out when I finish up here. So my name is Mimi Ernest-Stanley. I am a physical therapist and athletic trainer based out of Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm an associate instructor at the University of Cincinnati in their Doctor of Physical Therapy programs, their Masters of Athletic Training program, and then their undergrad College of Allied Health. And I'm here today to talk a little bit about my work with the Bridge Adaptive Recreation, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that I started with some of my friends and colleagues, and then how preparing future healthcare professionals to work with people who have various disabilities, some different ways that we're doing that here in Cincinnati. You can go ahead to the next slide. So at the Bridge, our mission is to increase awareness and promote opportunities for individuals with disabilities to fully participate in competitive and leisure activities. And we do that through three different things. First, we have an adaptive equipment program in which we will loan some equipment that we have to people to try. And then if they like what they're doing, we will help them find access to a grant or help them purchase some adaptive equipment so that they can continue to be active. The second thing we do, which is what I'm going to talk mostly about here, is connecting people to sport and recreation. And under that pillar follows our awareness and education initiatives. And then the third thing that we do is help support existing programs within our community that serve people with disabilities, and then also work with people to develop something if there's something that doesn't exist in Cincinnati that they want to do, which there's a lot. So as far as education and awareness, like I said, I teach at the University of Cincinnati. And this year, my friend and colleague, Danny Meyer, who's also a physical therapist at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, asked me if I wanted to help him teach an adaptive sports course in the physical therapy program. And we did it, and it was awesome. So it's a 1-credit course from both the fall and the spring semester for second-year DPT students. So we meet for about an hour a week. And of course, we've covered different things in adaptive sports, like things that would fall more into like sports medicine, what are the biomechanics of wheelchair propulsion? We did a VO2 max on a seated athlete. But another important part of that is, as someone who loves working with adaptive athletes on the sports medicine side, we always have to recognize, even regardless of settings, that I won't have the opportunity to work for athletes if there are not opportunities that are accessible for athletes that exist. So a large thing of what we did in this adaptive sports course was to talk about the barriers to access. We talked about performing a needs assessment in our community to see what we could do to serve the most individuals with disabilities. And what we ended up doing was having this, I'll talk about it on the next slide, but we had this disability soccer clinic that featured 5 different disciplines of adapted soccer. So kind of moving on to my work in the athletic training program. Sorry, Brendan, you can go backwards on that one. There we go. So I also teach the neuroanatomy course in the Masters of Athletic Training program. And one thing that I think has been integral, and I think that could really change in a lot of education for healthcare professionals, regardless of what profession they're going into, is integrating even just orthopedic or musculoskeletal situations into the questions and into the different scenarios that we give our students. So in the applied neuroanatomy course, we would maybe talk about carpal tunnel syndrome in a wheelchair athlete, and how would we treat that and how would we assess that. And then also in the athletic training program, we're going to have a special topics course in adaptive sports, which I'm really excited about. So we talked about some basic things in the neuroanatomy course, but then we're going to talk a little bit more about adaptive versus inclusive sports, and then as well as some of the sideline management techniques that to be used with adaptive athletes. In addition to that, both me and some other members of our board at the Bridge speak at the other universities here in Cincinnati as guest lecturers. And then one of the other things we're doing is to have an advocate program within the local hospital systems, because there are some opportunities that exist here in Cincinnati. We have wheelchair basketball, wheelchair tennis, all sorts of things. But a lot of the healthcare providers within different networks, if they weren't exposed to adaptive sports and recreation in undergrad or in their graduate program, they aren't even going to be thinking about what exists in Cincinnati and how can they help bridge, there's a pun there, bridge their patient from being a patient in a physical therapy clinic to being active in what their life is going to look like after discharge. Because if I put in a bunch of work as a neurophysical therapist with someone who has had a stroke, if they aren't continuing to be active, all of the gains, all of the time and money that was just spent on helping them improve their functional activity so they can be as independent as possible is going to start to decline if they're not trying to do things to maintain it. You can go to the next one, Brendan, thank you. So what we did with our doctor of physical therapy students, it just happened this past Saturday. It was so much fun. We had athletes and we had coaches fly in from CP or para soccer. We had people come in for power soccer. We had people come in and demonstrate blind and visually impaired soccer. We had top soccer there, and then we had amputee soccer as well. But we had over 200 athletes, and about half of them had never tried to play soccer ever before in their life. But on Saturday, they got to do that. We also had 70 volunteers, and quite a lot of them were from our College of Allied Health Sciences. So for me, at first, we were kind of overwhelmed with how many volunteers we had. But at the same time, me as a teacher looked at that as, even if I have 50 volunteers, at least when they go on to whatever health profession they're in, they're going to be able to know what an adaptive sport is and to say, hey, you know, here's something that you could do within your community. We also had U.S. Soccer Grassroots Coaching certifications that for the first time ever had special considerations for working with athletes with disabilities who play soccer. And then we also had a mental health first aid training as well. And all of this was really led and planned by 7 doctor of physical therapy students at the university. And because of their hard work, we're going to be able to start a CP or para soccer program down here, as well as a power soccer program too, because of the interest from both participants and people who would help to run those particular sports. This might be my last slide, I'm not sure. Yeah. So those are just a few of the things that we're doing here in Cincinnati. I'm excited for what the future holds, and I think that a lot of things are growing to help give students the opportunity to be exposed to athletes with disabilities, and that's going to help improve the health and quality of life of many people in the long run. Thank you. I'll put my contact information in the chat as well.
Wow, lots of exciting stuff happening at the Bridge, and I see a lot of connections there that I'm very I'm optimistic about between the programs here, so we will connect. But hi everyone, my name is Erik Robeznieks. I'm the Assistant Director of Adaptive Sports and Fitness at the University of Michigan. I am a white male with short blonde hair. I'm wearing a gray suit with a gold and blue pattern tie and a navy shirt. And behind me is a virtual background of the University of Michigan Adaptive Sports and Fitness logo and one of our wheelchair tennis athletes. Now, the reason why I start off in that way, and tied to the theme of my segment, is really that accessibility and inclusion is the entire user experience. It was mentioned before that often inclusivity, or when it comes to accessible practices, is viewed as something of a one-off interaction program activity. And to kind of double down on that statement earlier is that we need to think about inclusive practices as a mindset from start to finish of interaction, of policy, of practice, of really that A to Z experience to make sure that everybody feels welcome and included, to support further involvement and opportunity and access and ability. So really with that, I hope that everyone takes away 3 things from this segment. Is that, again, it was mentioned before that we're coming up on 31 years of the ADA, but despite the existence of the ADA for such a long time now, really ableism pervades many aspects of our society still, and particularly when it comes to accessing physical activity opportunities, whether it's K through 12, university, and in other kind of areas of our social lives. Also, that accessibility and inclusivity is a mindset. As was talked about before, it's not a one-off interaction. It's really thinking about how your organization from top down and bottom up needs to really take accountability and ownership over inclusivity practices and how that translates to opportunities, translates to involvement, translates to participation, and really creating an add value for everyone involved. And lastly, that inclusivity and when it comes to accessible programming and adaptive sport, it all really comes down to partnership and collaboration among partners, leveraging communities, leveraging groups, leveraging people that have expertise in their specific areas that can really add to your programming, as opposed to creating programs or services or goods in separation or in isolation, not in collaboration with others that can offer added value of experience. Next slide, please. So want to start off with a brief case study here, not directly related to adaptive sports and fitness in any way, or the program here at University of Michigan, but a local company that I would like to highlight back in my home country of Newfoundland in Canada, a company called Studio Verso that I think has done a really good job of applying these principles of inclusivity and accessibility in their practice. So Brendan, if you could play the video for everyone, please. Oh, you may need to share your screen with sound.
It means so much. Before, there was not a whole lot of accessible spaces where I could go and train with my friends, and the majority of my friends are able-bodied. So to have the opportunity to go and take part in a fitness class with them means so much.
The reason we decided to open this facility was really what moving your body does for your overall wellness. And we felt that it was so important to extend that to as many people as physically possible. So having a machine in our space that's accessible is part of that. So this is our Invictus Trainer, which is a wheelchair treadmill. So someone in their day chair is able to back on to this machine, and the cylinders on the Invictus Trainer rotate with the wheels of a wheelchair.
My name is Danielle Erber. It was super cool. I'd never been on something like an Invictus Trainer before. I'd been on like an actual wheelchair treadmill, but this was a whole different level. I've used it in a spin class, and I'm registered for one for the following week, but I think I'm a wheelchair basketball athlete, and it really helps with my stamina, my endurance, and I can see it helping with my speed in the long run.
Well, accessibility looks different for...
That's good. Thank you, Brendan. You can pause the video there. So the reason why I wanted to give that example, a few thoughts really come to mind when we talk about inclusive opportunities on campuses for recreation, fitness, and sport, is recognizing that when it comes to providing opportunities for people with physical disabilities, it does not need to be a separate opportunity. It does not need to be a separate facility, a program, equipment, what have you. There are ways and there are practices that can be employed that create inclusion such that a fitness class can be for everyone with and without disabilities. And one of the primary barriers that people often come across when trying to promote when people try to promote inclusion of people with disabilities and promote activity and physical activity for people with disabilities is the financial burden or the resources or the staffing associated with creating additional opportunities for people with physical disabilities. But that does not always necessarily need to be the case. Is that really at the base of it, or at the premise of it, how we look at adaptive sport is that it's the alteration or the adjustment of a piece of equipment or policy or rule or practice that then allows equitable opportunity for everyone to be able to participate in recreation, fitness, or sport. And I think that Studio Verso does a very good job in demonstrating how spaces, about how policy, about how marketing and branding and staff training can really be catered in a way that creates an environment that's inclusive of everyone. Next slide, please. Next, I'd like to talk about a dissertation that was done by a colleague in this space by the name of Tyler Spencer, that really the paper examined the inclusivity of recreation spaces on campuses. And I would highly recommend this to everybody watching or tuning in today, as there are a number of really great recommendations from that paper, and recommendations that I think we practice and that I've seen other adaptive sport programs and other the bridge that they involve as well. And really, to start off, is that inclusivity and accessibility starts with your vision, mission, and goals from the top down, but that is just the beginning. That just kind of gets your that gets you on the right track, but it cannot start and end with your vision, mission, and goals. Is that there ultimately has to be that bottom up driver and top down driver and buy-in and accountability when it comes to inclusivity practices. There need to be committees or an accountability process to make sure that the vision, mission, and goals actually go into practice. This happens a lot in collegiate sport and on campuses already, whether it's indexes or checklists or processes that exist to make sure that departments and programs and units are in compliance with certain measures. And when we look at accessibility and inclusivity of fitness programming, this is something, again, that could be applied to those situations to make sure that an organization that does have a vision, mission, and goals that align with inclusivity and accessibility are actually being put into practice. And then beyond that, going in, looking at your hiring processes, your staff training, and recognizing, as was mentioned before, that the ADA is just the ground floor. It really is the minimum in terms of what can be done to create an inclusive space for people to engage in physical activity. And like I mentioned before, and I'll get into some examples, creating an inclusive atmosphere comes down to the relationships and partnerships that support inclusion. And lastly, just really want to call out the fact that I think that ties to the number of different segments that were discussed today, is that involvement in physical activity and sport and recreation really needs to encourage and foster autonomy of determination and empowerment of the individual to then have the opportunity, to have the choice, to have the ability to participate in the programming that they would like to participate in. Next slide, please. So to talk about adaptive sports and fitness a little bit more in what we do and how this all connects. The purpose of adaptive sports and fitness at the University of Michigan is to increase awareness, knowledge, access, opportunity as it relates to adaptive sports for people with and without disabilities, recognizing again that adaptive sports does not have to be something that is exclusively for people with disabilities. Is one of the guiding mantras around this philosophy for us is the phrase, if you can sit, you can play. When you think about adaptive sports, really the rules, the modifications of the equipment, the rules, the policies are there so that everybody can play in an equitable fashion. Everybody can sit in a wheelchair to play wheelchair basketball or wheelchair tennis. Everybody can sit on the floor to play sitting volleyball. Everybody can put on a blindfold to create that equity to play goal ball. And that's one of kind of the guiding principles of the program and a lot of what we do. Next slide, please. So overall, there are 5 key branches of our program that we really try to carry this forward in. One is our adaptive sports and fitness student group, recognizing that from the ground up, we can cultivate on the ground support from our students, from our graduate students, to get their voices as to what is important when it comes to creating accessible programming. Our prescription to play initiative aligns very closely with what the Bridge is doing, is recognizing that many people go through the healthcare system and have relationships, long-standing relationships with PTs and OTs and primary care physicians, where so many of them don't even know that they can access adaptive sport in their community as a means to support their community integration, long-term health and wellness, et cetera, et cetera. We have our adaptive sport and inclusive recreation initiative, where we're involved with the K-12 schools in Ann Arbor, where we're specifically in the elementary schools introducing adaptive sport and integrating it as part of the physical education curriculum in the grade 6 curriculum recognizing again that when you look at physical education standards for the state of Michigan, it's all about from getting from point A to point B, or scoring a goal, or achieving an objective with your team. All of those physical education standards can be done in a way that is inclusive of people with disabilities, just by creating curriculum and lesson plans that makes those modifications that create an equitable environment for people to participate. Our adaptive fitness branch of the program exists really primarily because people with disabilities might not necessarily want to be athletes or play in a sport. You know, some just want to be physically fit, just like everyone else. They want to go to the gym, they want to work out, whether that's for the health reasons, aesthetics, the social aspect, or really just the community aspect of being a college student. And then lastly, we have the adaptive sports side of the program, which caters towards the athletic and competitive interests of our student athletes. Next slide, please. So to make some connections to what we're doing as a program and what I talked about earlier, related to Studio Verso and the paper by Tyler Spencer, the way that we look at adaptive sport, recreation, and fitness, again, the modification of the rule, a policy, or equipment is really kind of the ramp for physical activity. The analogy being, when you look at a building, and to get in the building, not everyone can use the stairs, but everybody can use the ramp to access that building. So when we think about programming that exists on college campuses, think about the ways that you can adjust a policy, a rule, the time of day, the instruction, the training, such that it creates an opportunity for everybody to be able to access that programming. And tied to this point is the point around including or creating opportunities for people with physical disabilities to engage in physical activity does not necessarily need to be separate. And there's that fine line of integration and inclusion in separate but equal. And that's just kind of a very important kind of conversation piece for organizations to have when they look at creating opportunities for the populations that they serve. Now, interestingly, a couple people had talked about adaptive sports programs, and I believe it was mentioned by Lisa about the difference between inclusion and integration in those different stages of progressions. And this is going to be interesting coming from someone who works for the adaptive sports and fitness program at the University of Michigan, but I don't necessarily believe that there should be an adaptive sports and fitness program at any institution, because really when you look at the kind of accountability and ownership over creating these opportunities, it should fall within intramural sports. It should fall within club sports, and it should fall within varsity sports. Is that there should be accountability and ownership of this work at every level of the institution for it to be done effectively and to meet everybody's needs at that institution. Greatest example is the USTA and the changes that they've made to their organizational structure over the last couple of years, where they transitioned from having a wheelchair tennis specific department at the USTA to now everyone or every department at the USTA has part of their role includes working with wheelchair tennis. Exactly, universal design. A great example of this, and I know Rose Dishman is on the call here watching as well, University Health Services has done a great job at this at University of Michigan, recognizing the access to health and health disparities that exist for students with disabilities on campus, and changing job descriptions, changing people's roles, changing people's responsibilities, such that it is specifically called out within their duties to support student athletes with disabilities that are part of the adaptive sports and fitness program and at the University of Michigan. And that's just an example of how policies, about how hiring practices, about how staff training can then be changed and can be altered to be more inclusive. And that it's not just about providing wheelchair tennis on a Thursday night, but it's about the fact that now other people at this university now have it as part of their role. It's expected of them to then support this inclusive practice on campus. And the last thing that I'll really wrap up with here is that is going back to the point around autonomy of determination and empowerment, is that too often inclusive policies and practices and value statements come from the top without recognition of what the actual population needs or wants. And a phrase that we use often and guides us in how we create our programming is nothing about us without us. And that is the thought that I'll leave with everyone today. So I'll leave my contact information in the chat, and thank you for tuning in.
Erik, thank you. Just a brief note before we proceed to the Q&A. Have had the honor of working with many of you that are from Michigan and Arizona in educating their personal training staff and some of the PT department at Michigan as well, to better equip the rec department with strategies to include students with disabilities on campus. Would love to be able to work with universities, and that was the idea of bringing this panel together to kind of get the ball rolling. But if you're interested in supporting your staff and kind of their continuing ed development in terms of being more inclusive and accessible in the rec departments on campus, we'd be happy to talk to you. These 4 panelists are great supports, and I suggest that you reach out to any of them with questions. And if you have specific questions related to inclusive fitness, I'd be happy to answer them as well. But we will move to the Q&A. I know there was one question directed at Lisa, and she has to sign off at 7. I'm not sure if she's still on or not, but there was a question about person first language versus identity first language. If you're still on, Lisa, do you have a
absolutely. Just to and that was a very good point. Thank you for bringing that up. That person first language is, to tell what a person has, not what a person is. So for the example I gave was that you would say a child with Down syndrome instead of the Down syndrome boy. But the question that was brought up is identity first, and there is definitely a movement, particularly within the autistic community and perhaps the deaf community, or really anyone. What we do is what I suggest is that we always start with person first language, and then if a person indicates that they prefer identity first, we would absolutely go with that. So I just wanted to clarify, and that was a very good point that was brought up.
All right, we will move through some of the Q&A. I believe a handful of them were directed at Annie, at least a couple of the first ones. So in reference to the first presentation, so Annie, what solution could be provided so that more college students with disabilities are able to get the accommodations that they need?
Yeah, I think couple things. Students should be doing their research on the front end and not just assume that all universities are providing the same accommodations and the same level of care in the accommodations that they are providing. So prospective students can connect with the Disability Support Office prior to applying. The admissions process is separate from the disability support process, and never the two shall meet. So the Disability Office doesn't call up the admissions department and make any disclosures. And it's really important for students to understand that there are some real differences in how universities approach the Disability Support Office approaches their role. Some are very focused on just meeting compliance standards, and others are focused on radical inclusion, which might be a term that Erik would really love to use. So, it's really important to not just check out the websites, because as a person who used to have to update the website at Georgetown University, I can say that my website ability was not amazing in putting all this information there, but to actually have a conversation, to shoot an email over, to talk to the people in the Disability Support Office about what that institution will do in terms of accommodations and how the process works there. Because again, it's different at every school. And Michigan is a shining star, but not every school is like that. So if you are interested, if students interested in recreation and sports activities, asking those questions up front is going to be a really important piece of that puzzle. And really making sure that the people in the Disability Support Office are willing to work with you, even if they haven't had inclusive sports programs before. To see, are they open to that? Could they work with you on it? That's a really important piece of the puzzle too, for people to understand. So I hope that helps.
Another question for you, Annie, was what are some common traits that students display that show that they need support?
I think you know, for a lot of students, especially students who have not had to navigate systems independently before, you know, there might be some challenges like every student has with independent living, with managing work and laundry and medication and going to school. And so one of the things that folks can do is just kind of look out, see how someone's doing, ask them how they're managing some of these things. You know, for most students, like the executive function skills of managing a calendar, like this is tricky for everybody, disability, no disability, whatever. So, you know, students should also be aware that many universities provide supports in those areas. So a lot of universities have academic supports and coaches that students can go and connect with and talk about time management and looking at some of the pieces of their lives. But, you know, I think that's an area that students forget to explore when they're investigating colleges as well.
Are there accountability measures that are in place to make sure that 504 isn't broken, or if these accommodations aren't met?
No, you know, the ADA is a civil rights law, and like most civil rights laws in every civil rights law in our country relies on litigation. So essentially, if the student is having an issue receiving the accommodations that they've been approved for, every university has a discrimination process that they could work through, or the student could file an Office of Civil Rights complaint, an OCR complaint, and that's at the state and federal level. So usually what I recommend, if the student isn't receiving an accommodation that they've been approved for, they should go back to the Disability Support Office and set up a time to have a conversation. And sometimes that's a conversation with the department and the Disability Support Office. So that could be the Recreation Department or the Athletics Department, and it could be a specific professor issue. But students, this is where I think it becomes tricky, because students don't always know what levers to pull. And so, you know, knowledge is power in this case. And so the student has to really be proactive in going back and having these conversations and following up with the Disability Support Office to let them know what's happening and to investigate next steps.
Excellent. We had another question that was, what are some good strategies for inspiring others in our own lives to practice inclusive behavior? That may be for Annie, that may be for one of our other panelists.
I'll let somebody else talk.
Yeah. Linda, Eric, do you have any ideas? So strategies to inspire others to practice more inclusive behaviors.
I think it really starts, you know, with yourself, is that the more that you can carry that forward in your practices, the way that you communicate, the way that you work, naturally that's going to set the tone for the relationships that you have professionally or personally with people. So that it has to start with yourself, and recognize that you're not always going to be able to persuade people to do one thing or the other, but recognizing that if you have kind of strong values and beliefs and convictions, as opposed when it comes to what accessible and inclusive practice looks like, is that you have to use that as a guiding principle for the actions that you take. And you can't make compromises to that. Or I guess there are ways to find a middle ground in a solution, but you can't ultimately compromise the values of why you're being inclusive, why you're being accessible in your practices. And hopefully through kind of over time, through interactions and work relationships, you'll eventually kind of connect with the people that will then kind of align with your method of thinking, with your methodology. Yeah, that's the advice that I could provide from that, from my perspective at least, or my experiences at the university so far.
I think an easy one that I am also still working on incorporating is including either image descriptions on your social media, or if it's a platform that automatically provides them, checking them and making sure that they're pretty accurate. And then I know for me personally, as an instructor who teaches courses, I always, even if a course is like given to me, like I did not write it, I always go back and make sure that it's on a PowerPoint or the Word document is accessible to people who use screen readers, because a lot of times they are not. Those are just some easy ones. But another way for me, or the way that I became more awareness of accessibility was that when I was hanging out with the wheelchair basketball teams here in Cincinnati, I traveled a lot with them, or we would go get dinner, and you see a lot of ways that society can improve as far as accessibility when you hang out and you have a friend who has some type of disability. You learn a lot from them, just from being their friend and not even having to ask about it.
Yeah, I'd like to think there's a similar trickle down effect from our facility when we have athletes with and without disabilities seamlessly coexisting, and it just becomes the standard, not really an exception. And our adults they learn how to interact with people who may do so differently than them. And that kind of has a trickle down effect that's hopefully executed outside of the gym as well. Erik, this may be a question for you. What do you believe is a main cause of exclusion in university sports, whether it's not being educated or something else? I feel like it's rare to hear about wheelchair sports in universities and should be more common.
Yeah, it goes back to my comment about ableism, is that whether it exists implicitly or explicitly, it does exist in all areas of the college campus. You know, a good discussion around that is access to facility space to run adaptive sport programming. For a long time, and still ongoing, there are ADA renovations that are going on at a facility on campus, or that were supposed to happen a while ago, that are still ongoing. And yes, the correct steps are being taken to then address the accessibility needs to make the building ADA accessible. But in the meantime, there is a lack of opportunity, a lack of access to spaces to address the kind of existing current need. So that's just one example. Another is really taking into consideration participants' interest and ability and access when it comes to creating programming. Is that we have found that it's been very important to conduct surveys, to be in contact with the population that we're aiming to serve when, you know, picking the days of the week that we run programming, picking the times, the locations, the equipment or programming that we're even able to offer based on the populations that show up to our programming, recognizing that there's so many micro interactions and occurrences before one even gets to the facility, gets to the location for programming, that can make it inaccessible. So I think is recognizing that the system is not set up in a way, whether that's the departments or organizations that exist, the programmings, the allocation of funding, the programming, the equipment. The system is currently not set up in a way that is meant to be accessible for people with disabilities to participate in physical activity programming. And it really just takes being conscious of that and recognizing how we can then incorporate kind of community voice, student voice, staff voices to then make those changes and work towards a kind of more inclusive model in how we do things.
And one more question for you, Erik. It says, Erik, you talked about people with disabilities building long-term relationships with their OT, PTs, and doctors. How are you planning to build long-term relationships with persons with disabilities in adaptive sports and fitness?
Yeah, so an example that has been discussed before is that we're actually working closely with our physical therapy department at University of Michigan Flint, where we've done guest lectures for their physical therapy program. And then as part of their course requirements or opportunities to earn additional credit, they've in turn come out to our adaptive sport programming, our strength and conditioning sessions, our wheelchair basketball and wheelchair tennis practices, to get that, for one, their firsthand experience as PTs in the field. Because as a physical therapist, you may come across as someone with a disability. You may come across patients with a disability in your practice. But then two is understanding that by getting them involved in our programming in the day-to-day of what we do, they're naturally going to see that people with disabilities face many of the same problems that people that are able-bodied do in their day-to-day lives, and others that they may have never thought of before. So that's one example of how we're connecting that gap and starting to build the inroads with physical therapy students. We're also then going to work with Michigan Medicine Rehab, different OT clinics, inpatient clinics, outpatient clinics, to then intentionally, and we're going to have even a part-time staff member that then goes around to these different clinics to do in-person interactions and information sessions and support groups for people with disabilities, to then connect them not only with our program, but other resources in the community that will support their health and wellness long-term. Really, the intention there is to build an infrastructure that creates community integration, thinking about the long-term health and wellness of the individual.
That was excellent. And then our last question here comes from one of my Team Hoyt teammates. Hey, Beth. So she is a middle school teacher, and she is continually pushing to remove her paraprofessionals from being students' partners in gym class and in the classroom. She asks if you can give us some strategies or places to start, videos, professional development, etc., to inform and educate some of these teachers. Do we have any ideas?
Is this for me?
I think it could be for any of the three. So how to have that conversation with paraprofessionals to not necessarily be partners, but to kind of more seamlessly.
And also for the teachers or the PE teachers to have things in place so my paras aren't the partners, you know.
Yeah, that was really the main theme of what we call the Adaptive Sport and Inclusive Recreation Initiative, a series, and it was quite successful over this past year. It started off with a educational or professional development session for the PE teachers, get them to understand that what has been perceived as inclusion before in PE class, whether the person with a disability is a scorekeeper or the coach or the water person or the partner of someone else, it does not need to be that way. Is that you can create opportunities for physical education that are inclusive of everyone, that still meet physical education standards that you're trying to achieve throughout the school year. Recognizing that there are a lot of sports, parasports, adaptive sports that mirror or are extensions of the normalized able-bodied sports. Recognizing that there's a basketball curriculum that is pretty mainstay across most physical education classes. While the same fundamental principles of basketball can be taught by doing wheelchair basketball, the same as it comes to sitting volleyball versus standing volleyball, and really getting the teachers to buy into the fact that adaptive sports are not just for people with disabilities, is that everybody can benefit from participating in adaptive sport. Not to say that in the future, able-bodied people will necessarily play adaptive sports, but they'll be able to recall on those experiences of when they did, and they'll be able to think about their own lives, about their own vocation, about their own studies in a slightly different and more inclusive way. It was then a matter of working with the PE teachers and in a PE teacher lead from the school board, then create lesson plans that really follow and mirror the existing lesson plans for that school district, but in a way that then intentionally includes disability and accessibility language and terminology, and even updating their existing lesson plans to make them more inclusive in terms of how they are introduced and conducted.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's an educational process for the staff or the PE staff as much as it is for the paras. Annie's shared a bunch of different resources there. I wanted to ask if you've tried to talk about it during IEP meetings as well. So that could be another approach.
So those, the paras don't come to the IEP meetings, nor do the PE teachers. And I just wanted to quickly just have Erik I'm so sorry, I don't want to take up too much more time, but when you say like the adaptive gym class, because there's some talk of they want to have a separate gym class just for my students, claiming then they could work on specific skill sets versus sort of educating the gym class. And like you said, you know, sitting on the floor, volleyball, or, you know, whatnot. What are your thoughts on the smaller setting with just students versus the entire class? And then I'm going to stop talking and I'll grab some of the links that I see everyone posting up.
Yeah, I think there's an opportunity for both to coexist, but recognizing what the implications are. You know, for example, we've had participants come to us with concerns when there are specific programs or classes that really kind of segregate them on the basis of disability, recognizing that if there's a specific class for people with disabilities, whether it's in the school or in college or etc., it really puts a position in a place where they're forced to disclose even if they don't want to, and takes away that autonomy and self-determination from them. But there are instances where, and I do see the benefits as well of having classes or programs or activities that are specific for people with disabilities, because there is that kind of underlying bond or connection or community that can be created, because it's bringing together people with similar, or perhaps in some way similar, lived experiences, and provides them an ability, provides them a platform to connect with one another and to really learn from one another because of those lived experiences. But that should not take away from the opportunity that exists to integrate, to have programming that is for able-bodied people and with disabilities, just because of the values that I think that kind of programming brings, is really that physical activity can be done in a way that is challenging, that is that promotes physical literacy development, that promotes social and mental development for people with and without disabilities, when it can be done together as well.
That sounds like a great conclusion to what I hope you all found to be a very informative event. Again, these four are excellent resources. They're great to have as part of my team that I can refer out to and consult with whenever I need to. So these are their emails. If you need anything, or if you have other questions, I'm sure they would be happy to answer anything you may have. But thank you for tuning in. Sorry we went a little bit over the 6 to 7 time frame, but hope we can stay in touch and run more events like this.